The town of Stillwater had always kept its secrets buried deep, but none were buried deeper than those in the old cemetery. Nestled at the edge of a dense, fog-shrouded forest, the cemetery was an ancient, forgotten place. Few in the town dared to venture there after dusk, and those who did would whisper about strange lights and cold spots that made the skin crawl. It was a place of hushed legends, where the past seemed to linger like a bad memory, and where the wind carried the sighs of those long gone. For over 30 years, Walter Graves had been the cemetery's caretaker. His name, ironically, seemed fitting for his profession, though it was one he had inherited rather than chosen. The cemetery had been in his family for generations, and when his father passed, Walter took up the mantle. It was a solitary life, one filled with routine and quiet, which suited Walter just fine. He had no family, no close friends, only the company of the dead. Walter was a man of habit. Each morning he would rise with the sun, dress in his worn, faded work clothes, and make his way to the cemetery gates. The iron gates, twisted and rusted with age, creaked ominously as he pushed them open. Once inside, he would walk the rows of gravestones, checking for any signs of disrepair. Weeds were pulled, flowers were trimmed, and fallen leaves were meticulously swept away. The cemetery was always pristine under his care, as if Walter were preserving the dignity of those who rested there. But lately, something had changed. There was an oddness in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on the cemetery like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Walter had begun to notice things out of place, nothing overt, just small disturbances that gnawed at his mind. A gravestone slightly tilted when it had been perfectly straight the day before. A tool misplaced, though he was certain he had left it on the workbench. The birds that once sang from the trees were now silent, leaving the cemetery eerily quiet. As the days passed, Walter found it harder to shake the feeling that something was watching him. At first, he dismissed it as the effects of age and solitude playing tricks on his mind. But the unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. One particularly foggy morning, as Walter made his usual rounds, he noticed something peculiar. A fresh mound of dirt beside an old, weathered grave, a grave that hadn't been opened in decades. The earth looked as though it had been disturbed recently, the soil loose and crumbly, as if someone or something had clawed its way out. A chill ran down his spine, and for the first time in his long tenure as caretaker, Walter felt a true pang of fear. Could it be the work of vandals? He muttered to himself, though the thought offered little comfort. Stillwater was a small town, and such acts of desecration were unheard of. Yet the alternative, that something else was responsible, was far more terrifying. Walter spent the rest of the day in a daze, his mind plagued by the image of the disturbed grave. As evening fell and the shadows stretched long across the cemetery, he made his way to the small stone cottage that served as his home on the cemetery grounds. Inside, the flickering light of a single oil lamp cast eerie shapes on the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes as if something was trying to get in. He settled into his chair by the fire, but the warmth did little to ease the cold that had settled in his bones. His thoughts kept returning to the grave, to the loose soil and the questions that came with it. As he sat there, the fire slowly dying, he could almost hear the faintest of whispers carried on the wind, a sound so soft it could have been imagined. But Walter knew better. He knew the dead had their ways of making themselves known, and this was only the beginning. The following days brought little solace to Walter Graves. The cemetery, once a place of quiet routine, now seemed alive with a presence he couldn't quite define. The unease that had taken root in his mind was beginning to bloom into something darker, something closer to dread. It started with the small things. The familiar path through the cemetery, which he had walked 1,000 times before, now felt strangely foreign. The gravel crunched too loudly beneath his boots, the air felt heavy, and the silence hung in the air like a thick fog, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. But the leaves weren't moving naturally. They seemed to twitch, as if unseen fingers were brushing them aside. One morning, as Walter approached a grave near the far corner of the cemetery, he noticed the headstone had shifted. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt to the left, but it was enough to catch his attention. He knelt down, trying to push it back into place, but the stone wouldn't budge. It was as if the earth beneath had swallowed it just enough to hold it firm. He frowned, puzzled. The ground had been solid the day before. Then there were the tools. His spade, his rake, his shears. Each had its place in the small wooden shed by the cemetery's entrance. Walter was meticulous about his tools. They were as much a part of his routine as the cemetery itself. But now they seemed to have a mind of their own. He would find the rake leaning against a tree, the spade half buried in a fresh patch of dirt, the shears resting on a gravestone as if someone had used them and left them behind. Walter tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was getting forgetful, he told himself. After all, the days tended to blur together when one lived a life as solitary as his. But deep down he knew that wasn't it. These were not the actions of an aging mind. They were deliberate, as though someone, or something, was toying with him. One evening, just as the last light of day was slipping away, Walter heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, carried on the evening breeze. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the rows of gravestones. There was no one there, of course, but the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, low and mournful, calling out from somewhere deep within the cemetery. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. A plea, a cry for help, or perhaps a warning. Walter's breath caught in his throat, his skin prickling with fear. He stood there, rooted to the spot, listening as the whisper faded into the growing darkness. His rational mind urged him to move, to leave the cemetery and return to the safety of his cottage, but his feet wouldn't obey. Something held him there, some invisible force that kept him listening, waiting. Finally, as the last light drained from the sky, Walter forced himself to turn away. He hurried back to his cottage, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he bolted the door behind him and lit every lamp he had, chasing away the shadows that seemed to creep closer with every passing minute. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the wind howled outside. The whisper echoed in his mind, a ghostly refrain that refused to be silenced. Sleep was a long time coming that night, and when it finally did, it was filled with dark, twisted dreams of cold hands reaching up from the earth. The next morning, Walter awoke with a start, the remnants of those nightmares clinging to him like a shroud. He knew then that something was terribly wrong, and whatever it was, it had no intention of letting him go. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more insistent as the days turned into weeks. Walter could no longer dismiss them as tricks of the wind or the imaginings of a lonely old man. They were real, and they were relentless. Every evening, as the shadows lengthened and the cemetery sank into darkness, the voices would return, soft at first, barely more than a murmur, but gradually rising to a chorus of mournful cries. Walter began to dread the night. He took to staying indoors after sundown, the windows tightly shut, the curtains drawn. But even within the confines of his small stone cottage, the voices found him. They seeped through the walls, through the very fabric of the night, haunting his every moment of solitude. The voices were not alone. The temperature inside the cottage dropped inexplicably, the air becoming thick with a chill that no fire could dispel. Walter wrapped himself in blankets, but the cold seemed to sink into his bones, as if the very presence of the spirits was leeching the warmth from his body. Sleep became a fleeting visitor, often leaving him tossing and turning until the first light of dawn. One particularly cold night, Walter sat in his chair by the dying fire, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He had tried everything, reading, pacing, even muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years, but nothing could drown out the voices. They were louder than ever, swirling around him in a cacophony of pain and anger. He could no longer make out individual words. It was as if dozens of voices were speaking at once, overlapping in a terrifying chorus. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the poker, stirring the embers in a futile attempt to revive the fire. The flames sputtered and flared briefly before dying down again, leaving the room bathed in a faint, flickering light. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the walls. And then he heard it, a voice clearer than the rest, distinct and close. "Walter." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, echoing through the room as if she were standing right beside him. "Walter, please." He whipped his head around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was no one there, only the empty room and the cold, dark night pressing in from all sides. The voice came again, more urgent this time. "Walter, help us!" His heart pounded in his chest, fear gripping him like a vice. He wanted to shout, to demand that the voices leave him in peace, but his throat was dry, his voice lost. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the voice repeated its plea over and over, the other voices rising to join it in a dissonant chorus. Unable to take it any longer, Walter leaped from his chair and stumbled toward the door. He fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking, and threw the door open. Cold air rushed in, cutting through him like a knife. He stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind, but the voices followed him, surrounding him, their cries echoing in the empty night. "Walter, you must help us." The cemetery lay before him, a sea of gravestones bathed in moonlight, the fog curling around them like spectral fingers. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising from the ground itself. He staggered forward, his feet carrying him toward the source of the voices, as if drawn by some unseen force. As he neared the center of the cemetery, the voices grew louder, more desperate. He stopped beside an old oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting against the night sky. Beneath it lay a row of graves, the stones weathered and cracked with age. "Walter." He knelt beside the nearest grave, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The name on the headstone was barely legible, worn away by time, but the earth beneath it looked freshly disturbed, as though something had recently moved within. Walter's hand hovered over the soil, his mind screaming for him to leave, to turn back and lock himself away in the safety of his cottage. But he couldn't move. The voices surrounded him, pulling him closer, their pleas ringing in his ears, impossible to ignore. "Help us." And in that moment, Walter understood. The spirits of the dead were not just haunting him. They were demanding something, seeking something only he could provide. But what that was, he didn't know. All he knew was that the night had only just begun, and there would be no peace until the voices had their due. The following morning, Walter awoke from a restless sleep, his mind still reeling from the events of the night before. The voices had subsided with the first light of dawn, leaving behind an unsettling quiet that felt just as unnatural. He knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. Whatever was happening in the cemetery, It was only getting worse, and the answer, if there was one, lay in the cemetery's past. Walter decided to dig deeper into the cemetery's history. He began with the old ledgers kept in the cottage, records dating back nearly 2 centuries, documenting every burial, every name that had ever been etched into a headstone. The ledgers were dusty and worn, the ink faded with age, but they were all he had. For hours he pored over the pages, his eyes straining in the dim light as he traced the history of the cemetery back through the years. It wasn't long before he started noticing discrepancies. Burials that hadn't been recorded properly, names that appeared more than once in different places, dates that didn't align. The deeper he delved, the more it became clear that something sinister had happened here long before his time. One entry in particular caught his eye. It was dated nearly 70 years ago, written in a shaky hand that suggested its author had been in great distress. The entry spoke of disturbances, graves unearthed in the dead of night, bodies missing, the earth itself seeming to reject the dead. It was an echo of what Walter was experiencing now, and it sent a shiver down his spine. But there was more. As Walter continued reading, he found mentions of a group of men, town officials, along with a few wealthy landowners, who had been involved in something dark, something they had gone to great lengths to cover up. The entry hinted at grave robbing, a practice long considered a thing of the past, but the details were vague, deliberately obscured. Walter's heart pounded as he realized the truth. These men had disturbed the graves, violated the sanctity of the cemetery, and now the spirits were exacting their revenge. But the records didn't reveal the full extent of their crimes. The real story was buried deeper, beneath layers of lies and forgotten memories. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Walter left the cottage and made his way back to the cemetery. The air was crisp, the sun weak behind a veil of clouds, casting a gray light over the gravestones. He walked the rows, his eyes scanning the names, the dates, the crumbling stones that marked the final resting places of the town's dead. He stopped at the graves beneath the old oak tree, the ones that had been disturbed, the ones from which the voices seemed to emanate. The names on these stones were worn nearly smooth, but with great effort Walter could make them out. They were names he had seen in the ledgers, names connected to the entries about the disturbances all those years ago. Kneeling beside the gravestone of a woman named Eleanor Finch, Walter brushed away the leaves and dirt that had collected at its base. The earth here felt different, loose, almost as if it had been turned recently. A cold dread settled in his stomach as he realized that the grave had likely been disturbed not just once, but multiple times over the years. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. Walter scrambled back, his heart racing as he watched the soil move, as if something was pushing up from below. The voices returned, louder now, clearer, demanding to be heard. "Restore us." Walter's breath quickened. He knew what they wanted. The spirits were trapped, bound to the cemetery by the desecration of their graves. They wanted to be put to rest, truly at peace, and they needed his help to do it. But how? Walter's mind raced. The crimes of the past couldn't be undone, and the men responsible were long dead themselves. Yet the spirits wouldn't let go until justice was served. He realized with growing horror that he was the only one who could give them what they sought, and the price for that knowledge was beginning to take shape in his mind. The final piece of the puzzle was still missing, but Walter knew it was only a matter of time before the spirits made their demands clear. As the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, he could almost hear them whispering the truth to him, a truth that would cost him more than he ever imagined. The dead were not finished with Walter Graves, not yet. The nights had grown longer, colder, as if the cemetery itself was bending time to prolong Walter's torment. The voices no longer confined themselves to whispers. They grew louder, more distinct, each one carrying the weight of untold suffering. It was no longer just an eerie chorus. It was a symphony of sorrow and rage, a cacophony that echoed through Walter's every waking hour. The disturbances escalated too. No longer content with shifting gravestones or misplaced tools, the spirits began to make their presence known in ways that left no room for doubt. One morning, Walter awoke to find every gravestone in the cemetery twisted at odd angles, as if the earth had convulsed beneath them. The sight was grotesque, the once orderly rows of graves now a chaotic jumble of stone and soil. The spirits were restless, their anger more palpable with each passing day. But it was the apparitions that truly shattered Walter's resolve. The first one appeared just after midnight. Walter had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing the comfort of sleep. The voices were quieter that night, almost as if they were waiting, biding their time. And then he saw it, a pale figure standing at the foot of his bed. The figure was indistinct, a shadowy form with no clear features, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Walter's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the apparition, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing toward the window. Walter's eyes followed the gesture, and through the frosted glass, he could see the cemetery, bathed in an eerie glow. The gravestones seemed to shimmer in the darkness, their shapes shifting and blurring as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. "Help us!" The words were barely a whisper, but they filled the room, reverberating in Walter's mind. The figure faded, melting into the shadows, leaving behind a cold that clung to the walls long after it was gone. Walter sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't ignore the call any longer. The spirits were demanding justice, and they were growing impatient. If he didn't act soon, he feared what they might do. But what could he do? The crimes of the past were beyond his control, beyond anyone's control, and yet the dead held him responsible. They saw him as the gatekeeper, the one who must set things right. The next night, the apparitions returned, this time in greater numbers. Walter saw them everywhere, standing among the gravestones, drifting through the fog, their forms shimmering in the moonlight. They didn't speak, but their eyes, dark, hollow, filled with an ancient pain, spoke volumes. They surrounded him, their presence suffocating, their silence more terrifying than any scream. Desperation gripped Walter as he realized there would be no peace until the spirits were satisfied. He could feel his sanity slipping, the constant pressure of the haunting wearing him down, breaking him piece by piece. The cold that clung to him, the voices that filled his ears, the apparitions that haunted his nights. They were unrelenting, and they were driving him to the brink. And then came the storm. It was as if the heavens themselves had been roused by the spirit's fury. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at the branches, sending leaves and debris flying through the air. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cemetery in brief, blinding flashes. The rain came down in torrents, drenching the earth, turning the cemetery into a muddy quagmire. Walter was trapped. The storm had cut off any hope of escape, leaving him alone with the spirits and their demands. The wind rattled the windows of his cottage, the voices mingling with the roar of the storm, forming a dreadful symphony of chaos. "Restore us." The words came again, clearer now, insistent, driving a spike of fear deep into Walter's heart. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it filled him with dread. The spirits wanted their graves restored, their memories honored. But more than that, they wanted the truth. The the terrible truth of what had been done to them, brought to light. As the storm raged outside, Walter knew he couldn't put it off any longer. The time had come to face the past, to dig up the secrets buried beneath the cemetery's soil, and to confront the darkness that had been hidden for so long. But he also knew that the spirits would not rest until justice was served, and the price for that justice might be more than he was willing to pay. The storm had passed, but the air remained thick with the tension of unfinished business. Walter Graves, the once proud caretaker of the cemetery, was now a man teetering on the edge of madness. The relentless torment of the spirits had broken something within him, leaving him hollow, a shell of the man he once was. He knew he had to act, but the weight of what lay ahead made his every step feel like a march toward doom. The morning after the storm, Walter stood at the edge of the cemetery, staring out at the rows of gravestones that stretched before him. The earth was still wet, the ground soft beneath his boots, as if it too was ready to give up its secrets. The voices were silent for now, but he could feel them waiting, watching, expecting him to do what must be done. With trembling hands, Walter picked up his shovel and walked to the old oak tree where the disturbances had begun. The graves here had been the focal point of the hauntings, the spirits tied to these plots more insistent than any others. He stopped before the grave of Eleanor Finch, the one he had seen shift and move in the night. The soil was loose, the ground uneven, as though something within had been stirring restlessly. Walter took a deep breath, steadying himself, and drove the shovel into the earth. The sound of metal biting into soil echoed in the quiet cemetery, a grim reminder of the task he was about to undertake. He dug carefully, methodically, the cold sweat of fear running down his back. With each shovelful of dirt he removed, he felt the presence of the spirits growing stronger, as if they were drawing nearer, their anticipation palpable. Finally, the shovel struck something solid. Walter knelt down and brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing the rotting wood of an old coffin. His heart pounded in his chest as he pried the lid open, half expecting the restless dead to rise up and pull him down into the grave. But the corpse within remained still, a decaying reminder of a life long extinguished. Yet there was something else. An object clutched in the skeletal hands of the deceased. Walter reached in, hesitating only for a moment before taking hold of it. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but still intact. He carefully opened it, the brittle paper crackling under his touch. The journal's contents were written in a delicate, flowing script. As Walter read the entries, the story of Eleanor Finch and the others buried here began to unfold. They were victims, not of disease or accident, but of something far more sinister. Murder, covered up by those in power, their deaths disguised as natural, their graves disturbed and their bodies desecrated to hide the evidence of the crimes committed against them. Walter's hands shook as he turned the pages, the horror of what had happened here settling over him like a dark cloud. The spirits had been denied justice in life, and even in death, they were not allowed to rest. The journal was the key to their torment, the proof of the wrongs done to them. And now it was in Walter's hands. He knew what he had to do. The truth needed to be brought to light, the crimes exposed, so the spirits could finally find peace. But as he closed the journal, he realized that justice for the dead required a sacrifice from the living. The spirits would not be satisfied with the mere revelation of the truth. They wanted retribution, and they had chosen Walter to deliver it. That night, as darkness fell over the cemetery, Walter gathered his courage and made his way to the center of the grounds. He stood there, the journal clutched tightly in his hands, as the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the faint whispers of the dead. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly as the spirits began to manifest around him, their forms drifting out of the shadows, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that chilled him to the core. "Restore us." The voice was louder now, more insistent, a command that could not be ignored. Walter held up the journal, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I will make this right. I'll bring your story to light, expose those who wronged you. But I can't do it alone. I need your help to make them pay." For a moment there was silence. Then, the spirits began to move, circling around Walter, their cold presence pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel their anger, their desperation, but also their hope, their need for someone to finally see them, to acknowledge their pain. And then they began to fade, one by one, their forms dissolving into the night. The cold receded, the air grew still, and the voices that had haunted him for so long finally fell silent. The spirits had found their peace, but only because they had passed their burden on to Walter. He had promised them justice, and now it was his responsibility to deliver it. As he stood alone in the quiet cemetery, the journal heavy in his hands, Walter knew that his life would never be the same. The dead had been laid to rest, but the task they had given him was far from over. He would have to expose the truth, no matter the cost, to ensure that the sins of the past were finally accounted for. And deep down, Walter understood that the ultimate sacrifice might still be required, for the dead never truly rest until the living have paid their dues.